All right, so welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to look at something that I think is particularly relevant right now. This whole idea of harmful ideologies and like what draws people to them. And, you shared some really interesting stuff with me. I had a chance to go through excerpts from some academic text, right? And then you added some of your own notes with like some historical examples, which is always really helpful. But basically what we're trying to do here is figure out how seemingly normal people, regular people, can end up, well, how they can be drawn into these dangerous belief systems, right? I think that's something we all kind of wonder about. So it's like recognizing those patterns, right? Like, how does this happen? What's the psychology? And then, okay, so how do we guard against that?
It's a question that I think has been around for a long time.
Yeah, exactly.
What makes these ideologies so compelling?
Right.
Even when you can see that they have really bad consequences. It's a tough one.
Yeah, it is. And, one of the things that the source kind of jumps right into is this idea of simplicity. Like the appeal of that, these ideologies, they offer like really simple explanations for stuff that's actually super complex, right? Like especially when things are uncertain, when the world feels kind of crazy.
Right.
Our brains just want to make sense of things. They want like a simple answer.
Yeah, we crave order, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's more than just wanting like a straightforward answer.
Okay.
It's the psychological comfort that comes with that black and white thinking.
Oh, interesting.
A lot of ideologies, they present a world that's divided up really neatly. It's us versus them, good versus evil.
Yeah.
And for some people, that's really appealing.
Yeah.
Especially, if they're the kind of person who doesn't like ambiguity, who has trouble dealing with all the complexities of the world.
Right. They just want it to be clear. Like, this is how it is.
Exactly.
Yeah. I can see that. It's like you're getting this prepackaged worldview. Mm-hmm. You just shut out all the noise, and finally you feel like, oh, I get it.
Right. You feel like you figured it all out.
Yeah. But that need to be certain, that need for a clear right and wrong, that can be, it makes people vulnerable, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because it makes you miss all the nuance.
Yeah.
Like most things in the real world, they're complicated. There aren't these simple solutions.
Right.
And that's where the danger is, because that simplification, that's what leads to demonizing whole groups of people.
Yeah.
It's like you're reducing complex human beings to just this caricature of the enemy.
Which kind of goes hand in hand with what the source says about group identity, right? And belonging. It's like, it's not just about buying into some ideas.
Right.
You're joining this tribe.
Yeah, it's about belonging.
Yeah. And that is super powerful for people who, well, maybe they feel like they're on the outside, or they don't fit in.
Yeah. Think about it. Humans, we crave connection. Mm-hmm. We want a purpose. We want to feel like we're part of something bigger than just ourselves. And harmful ideologies, they exploit that. They create this really strong sense of in-group solidarity. And it's often based on, shared grievances or this idea that we're under attack.
Oh, I see. So it's not just that you agree with the ideas.
Right.
It's that you become part of this community, this group that understands you, and they say, we're going to fight for you, right?
Exactly.
The source mentions, it specifically calls out how this can be really appealing for younger people.
Oh, yeah. When you're young, you're still trying to figure out who you are. Right? Where you fit in the world.
Right.
And these groups, they give you a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, even a whole identity, really. And I think that's really powerful, especially when you combine that with the promise of simple solutions to really complex problems.
Yeah. It's a powerful mix.
It is.
And then there's the whole thing about fear, right? The source talks about how fear, and that could be a fear of like the other or fear of change or I don't know, just fear of the economy, money problems.
Right.
All of that can push people towards these ideologies that say, don't worry, we've got you, we'll keep you safe.
Oh, yeah. Fear is a really basic emotion, right? It can completely shut down our ability to think rationally.
Really?
Yeah, it can. And that makes it so much easier to manipulate.
Wow.
And, a lot of ideologies exploit that. They create this whole narrative, this story about how there's a threat and we need to protect ourselves from them.
Yeah, it's us versus them.
Exactly.
That whole siege mentality. And the ideology is like the shield, right, to protect you from all the bad stuff out there in the world. And the source, they give some pretty scary historical examples of how this works. Like, you were talking about the Red Scare earlier.
Oh, yeah, the Red Scare. That's a classic example. It's that fear of an outside threat, in that case, communism.
Right.
And they just whipped up this mass hysteria. People were so terrified of communists infiltrating, their communities, their government, that they turned on each other. Oh, yeah. Neighbors, friends, even family members, just based on, like, the smallest accusation.
Oh, wow.
It was really scary.
It is kind of scary. I mean, it just shows you how quickly fear can make people forget about critical thinking.
Right.
And then basic rights and freedoms just go out the window.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then you have like the Salem witch trials, which, I mean, that's terrifying. It's like this fear of the unknown, but also all these existing social anxieties and prejudices.
Right.
And that just turned into this mass paranoia and scapegoating.
And what's really fascinating about the Salem witch trials, and I think it connects back to what we were talking about earlier about simplicity, is that it gave people a way to understand all the bad things that happened to them.
Oh, interesting.
Like, instead of trying to deal with how complicated life is, they could just say, oh, it's the witches.
Yeah.
They're the reason I'm having a bad harvest.
Right, right.
It was this simple explanation. Obviously totally wrong, but simple.
So blaming the witches was like, it gave them some control in a world that was just feeling more and more out of control and scary.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a good reminder that when people are scared, they'll grab onto whatever explanation they can get, even if it doesn't make sense, even if it's not based on anything real.
It's true.
Yeah. And that whole scapegoating thing, that's a big part of a lot of these harmful ideologies. They need an enemy, somebody to blame for everything that's wrong.
Right. It's that other.
Yeah. And that enemy, I mean, it can change, right?
Oh, yeah. It depends on what people are scared of at the time.
Right. Okay. So we've got these psychological needs and fears that make people vulnerable, right? But then the source points to something else, another ingredient, and it's these charismatic leaders.
Ah, yes. These are the people who kind of become the face of the ideology, you know?
Yeah.
They give it a voice. And they're often really good at manipulating people, at tapping into those needs and fears that we were just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
They come in and say, hey, I've got the answers. Come join me.
Yeah, like join my tribe and I'll keep you safe from the bad guys.
Exactly.
And they package it all up in this, well, in this story that's really compelling, really emotionally powerful.
Oh, they're master storytellers.
Right. And they become these larger-than-life figures offering this path to, I don't know, like salvation.
Yeah, a way out of the darkness.
Yeah. And history's full of examples of this, right? Like Hitler, Mao Zedong, figures like that. They exploited these very human weaknesses to gain power.
Oh, absolutely. And what's interesting about someone like Hitler is that he didn't just use people's existing fears.
Yeah.
He created new ones.
How did he do that?
He was a master of propaganda. He used techniques like scapegoating and repetition to build this atmosphere of fear and resentment. And then, of course, he used that for his own political gain.
So it's a reminder that we can't just sit back and passively absorb information.
Right.
Especially now with social media and all these echo chambers.
Yeah, where misinformation can just spread like wildfire.
Exactly. We have to be more critical, right? Like question what we hear, be aware of the tactics people are using to try to manipulate us.
That's a great point. And it's a perfect lead into what I wanted to talk about next. The source really emphasizes how important it is to recognize those subtle ways that these ideologies can take root, and then, well, how they escalate over time.
You're talking about the slippery slope, right?
Exactly.
It's like you get drawn in little by little, and you might not even realize how bad things are getting until it's too late.
Exactly. It starts subtly. Maybe you start using the same language, or you accept a few ideas that, well, maybe you should question them a little more closely.
Right.
But then the lines get blurred, and things that would have been unthinkable before suddenly become normal.
So is there an example in the source material that could help us understand this a little better?
Oh, absolutely. The Stanford Prison Experiment is a perfect example.
Yeah.
It's a really chilling study. What they did was they took a group of ordinary college students and randomly assigned them to be either guards or prisoners in this like fake prison environment. And it's supposed to last like 2 weeks, but they had to stop it after just 6 days.
Oh, wow. Why? What happened?
It got out of hand. The guards, I mean, these were just regular college kids, right? But they started acting so brutal, so authoritarian.
Really?
It was shocking, yeah. And the thing is, they hadn't been given any special training or anything. There was nothing to suggest they'd act this way.
That's wild. So basically, they just put on the uniform and they turned into these, like, mini dictators.
Basically, yeah. It shows you the power of the situation, you know, and the roles we play. Like, you put someone in a position of power, and it can change them.
So are you saying that if you put any random person in that kind of environment, they would become like that?
I don't know if I'd go that far.
Right.
But the study definitely shows how easily people can fall into these harmful behaviors, especially in a certain environment where they have power over others.
Yeah, it's kind of a disturbing thought. Like, if these were just regular students, what does that tell us about what can happen in the real world?
Right. I mean, in the real world, the stakes are higher. There's actual power and ideologies at play. It's pretty sobering.
It is. And the source brings up the Holocaust,
Yeah.
which obviously everyone knows how horrible it was. But, it's important to remember it didn't just happen overnight.
No, not at all. The way the Nazis persecuted Jews, it escalated in stages.
Right, right.
So you had these discriminatory laws at first,
Okay.
and the propaganda was constantly dehumanizing Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Then they were forced to relocate. They were put in ghettos.
Right.
And ultimately, it led to this systematic extermination that we all know about.
And that's what they mean by the slippery slope, right?
Exactly. Each step, if you look at it by itself, might have seemed, well, maybe even justifiable to some people back then.
Yeah, I guess if you're caught up in that ideology, it all starts to make sense.
But when you step back and see the whole picture, it's horrifying. It shows you how even these small compromises can lead to just unimaginable atrocities.
It's like that analogy of the frog in the boiling water, right?
Exactly.
You drop a frog into boiling water, it jumps right out. But if you put it in cold water and slowly heat it up, it doesn't realize it's in danger until it's too late.
That's a perfect analogy. And it's why it's so important to be aware of these incremental steps, to recognize the warning signs and speak out against injustice, even when it feels uncomfortable or inconvenient.
Yeah, even when it's easier to just stay quiet.
Because history shows us that staying silent, being complacent, that can be just as bad as actually participating.
That's a really good point. So I guess the question is, why is it so hard for people to resist? Even when they start to see what's happening, why don't they just say, no, I'm not doing this?
That's a great question. And the source talks about a couple of psychological mechanisms that are at play here. One is called cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
It's basically when you have this mental discomfort because your actions and your beliefs are clashing.
Okay, so like if someone is really into an ideology, but then it starts leading to these harmful things, they start feeling that cognitive dissonance because they're like, wait, this is wrong, but I believe in this.
Exactly. And to deal with that discomfort, they start rationalizing their actions,
Right.
They might twist the facts or even ignore their own moral compass just to feel okay about what they're doing.
It's like they have to convince themselves that they're still the good guys, even when everything's pointing in the other direction.
It's a form of self-deception, really.
Wow, that's powerful.
It is. And it helps people stay committed to the ideology, even when it's leading them down a path they know is wrong.
And what was the other thing you mentioned?
Oh, diffusion of responsibility.
Yeah.
This is when people feel less accountable for their actions because they're part of a group.
Okay, like that I was just following orders thing.
Exactly.
So with these harmful ideologies, someone might do things they'd never do on their own. But because they're part of this group, they feel like it's okay.
They shift the blame to the group, to the leader, to the ideology itself.
Anyone but themselves.
Right. It becomes easier to justify their actions, even really bad ones,
Yeah.
because they don't feel fully responsible.
I can see how those two things would work together to make it really hard to walk away. But what I find interesting is that the source doesn't just talk about these concepts in this dry academic way.
Right.
They use real-world examples, situations that everyone can relate to.
And that's what makes this deep dive so engaging.
Yeah.
It helps us understand these psychological mechanisms in a way that feels relevant to our own lives.
Right. It's not just theory. It's like, oh, I can see how this applies to me, to people I know.
Exactly. It's about understanding the forces that shape our own behavior and the behavior of those around us.
And that's why I think this whole conversation is so important. It's not just about understanding these ideologies in a historical context.
Right.
It's about giving ourselves the tools, the knowledge, the critical thinking skills to resist those influences in our own lives and in our communities.
I completely agree. And the source makes a really good point. It's not enough to just understand these mechanisms. We have to actively cultivate the antidote.
Okay, so what's the antidote?
It's critical thinking and open dialogue. Just telling people they're wrong, just hitting them with facts, that doesn't usually work.
Right, that doesn't change anyone's mind.
No, not usually. Critical thinking is about questioning your assumptions, seeking out different viewpoints, looking at the evidence, and being willing to change your mind when you get new information.
So it's about being engaged, not just passively absorbing whatever you see and hear.
Exactly. And open dialogue is about creating spaces where people can safely express their doubts, ask questions, and consider different perspectives without feeling judged.
Oh, so it's not about attacking each other or shutting down the conversation.
No, it's about creating an environment where intellectual curiosity and respectful debate are actually valued, where
Right.
people can challenge each other's ideas without getting personal or hostile.
Because if we can't even talk to each other about these tough issues, how are we ever going to understand them, let alone solve them?
Open dialogue doesn't mean you have to agree with everything you hear, but it does mean creating a space where ideas can be challenged, debated, refined, without resorting to like hostility or shutting people down. And I think it's important to remember that even people who hold harmful beliefs, they're still human beings.
Right.
They deserve our respect, even if we completely disagree with their views.
It's like we can hate the idea, but we don't have to hate the person.
Exactly. And that open dialogue, that willingness to listen and engage, that can be the first step in helping someone break free from a harmful ideology.
That makes sense. But how do we actually challenge these ideologies effectively? Are there strategies that are proven to work?
Well, I think building relationships and fostering open dialogue, like we talked about, is a good start. Creating spaces where people feel safe to express their doubts, ask questions, consider different viewpoints, that's key.
So it's about building that trust first, right? Especially if we're talking to someone who's really dug in, really believes in this stuff. But what about other strategies? Besides just talking, what else works?
Well, another approach is to counter those harmful narratives with something positive. If the ideology is all about fear and hatred and division, we have to be promoting hope and compassion and inclusivity.
Okay, so it's not enough to just, debunk the myths, call out the lies. You have to give them something better to believe in.
Exactly. And that's where storytelling can be really powerful. Personal stories, highlighting things we have in common, shared values, that could be way more effective than just, hitting people over the head with facts and logic.
So you're saying it's not just about the head, it's about the heart, too.
Exactly. It's about reminding people that we're all human, even when these ideologies are trying to divide us, trying to make us see each other as less than human.
Right, right. But this isn't something that happens overnight, is it?
Oh, no. Changing hearts and minds, that takes time and patience. And you can't give up.
Yeah, it's an ongoing thing. But okay, let's be real. There are going to be times when talking, having that dialogue just isn't possible or even safe.
Right.
Like if you're dealing with extremists, people who are just so entrenched in their beliefs and they're not going to listen.
Right. And in those cases, the most important thing is your safety. You don't have to debate every internet troll or try to de-radicalize someone who's completely committed.
So know when to walk away.
Absolutely. Sometimes the best way to fight these ideologies is to focus on building a better world, a world that's more just and equitable and compassionate, where these ideologies just don't have the same power.
As it's like individual action and collective effort, right?
Yeah.
Being careful about what we're consuming, having those tough conversations when we can, and then working together to create a society where critical thinking and empathy are valued.
That's a great way to put it.
Well, we covered a lot today.
We did.
We talked about the psychology of why people are drawn to these harmful ideologies, looked at historical examples of what happens when they take hold, and talked about some strategies for resisting them. And I don't know, maybe this is a lot to process.
Oh, it is. It's complex.
Yeah. But, the important thing to remember is you're not alone.
Yeah, there are so many people and organizations out there working to fight these ideologies, to promote critical thinking, to build empathy.
That's good to hear. And if anyone's listening and they want to learn more, we'll put some resources in the show notes, books, articles, other podcasts, lots of good stuff out there. But before we go, can I just bring up something you said earlier about media literacy, especially with all the information overload we have now and all these echo chambers online?
It's so important now more than ever. We're just bombarded with information from everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's hard to know what to trust, what's real, what's biased, what's just completely made up.
Mm-hmm.
And these harmful ideologies, they thrive on that confusion.
Right. They use those emotional appeals, those manipulative tactics.
Exactly. So we have to be critical of the ideologies, yes, but also critical of the information we're consuming.
So how do we get better at that? At being more media literate?
Well, you have to start by being aware of your own biases, because we all have them.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's about making a conscious effort to seek out different viewpoints, questioning what you see and hear, and really looking at the source, like who's giving you this information, why?
Don't just take things at face value.
Exactly. Don't be a passive consumer. Be active, be engaged.
I like that. Be an active participant. It takes work, but it's worth it.
Absolutely. It's how we protect ourselves from manipulation.
This has been a really great conversation. Thank you. But any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap up?
Just this. The next time you come across a really powerful ideology, or even just a really persuasive person, Stop for a minute and ask yourself, what are they appealing to? Are they playing on people's needs and fears? Are they encouraging people to think for themselves? Or are they just demanding obedience?
That's a great question.
We all have a part to play in building a world where these harmful ideologies lose their power, where empathy and our shared humanity win out over fear and division.
I love that. A message of hope. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep thinking critically.
This is DigitView.